In 1941, the United States Army Air Forces asked a single question that would consume billions of dollars, nearly a decade of engineering effort, and the careers of some of America's most brilliant aviation minds. The question was simple. Could a bomber fly from the continental United States, strike a target anywhere in Europe or the Pacific, and return without a single refueling stop? The answer was supposed to be the Northrop XB-35, a flying wing so radical, so aerodynamically pure, that it seemed to belong to another era entirely. It flew. It was real. And then, without adequate public explanation, it was gone. Not shot down, not destroyed in combat, quietly cancelled. Its prototypes scrapped, its future deliberately erased. This is the story of how America's most ambitious bomber project of the Second World War was born from desperation, built by genius, plagued by failure, and ultimately buried not by the enemy, but by forces far closer to home. To understand why the XB-35 existed at all, you have to go back to the darkest months of 1940. France had fallen. Britain was under siege. American military planners were staring at maps of the Atlantic and confronting a nightmare scenario. What if Britain fell too? If the Royal Air Force lost the Battle of Britain, the United States would have no forward base in Europe, no airfields in England from which to strike the continent. Every conventional bomber in the American inventory, the B-17, the B-24, anything with a fuselage and a tail would be stranded, too short-ranged to reach Europe from American soil and return. The Army Air Forces needed a bomber that could operate from North America itself, a true intercontinental weapon. Range requirements were staggering for the era: 10,000 miles, a bomb load of 10,000 pounds, a cruising speed that would make interception difficult. No aircraft in existence came remotely close. In April 1941, the Air Forces issued a formal requirement. Several manufacturers were approached. Only one submitted a proposal so unconventional, so geometrically strange, that it genuinely stopped the evaluation committee. That proposal came from Jack Northrop. John Northrop, known universally as Jack, was already considered one of the most visionary aircraft designers in America. He had spent years obsessing over a single concept: the flying wing, an aircraft with no fuselage, no tail surfaces. The entire aircraft was the wing, and the wing was the aircraft. Every pound of structural weight that would normally be consumed by a fuselage and empennage was eliminated. The aerodynamic efficiency, in theory, was extraordinary. Northrop had been working toward this concept for over a decade. He had built scaled flying wing designs before. But the XB-35 contract, awarded in November 1941, just weeks before Pearl Harbor, gave him the resources to attempt something no one had ever attempted at this scale. The stakes were real. The timeline was brutal. And the aircraft Jack Northrop was about to build had never existed in anything close to this form before. The contract called for 2 flying prototypes and 1 static test airframe. Northrop Aircraft, based in Hawthorne, California, threw the full weight of its engineering division at the problem. The design team worked around a fundamental principle. The XB-35 would carry its crew, its fuel, its armament, and its bomb load entirely within the thickness of the wing itself. The wing chord was so deep, so cavernous, that crew members could stand upright inside sections of it during ground maintenance. The sheer scale of the aircraft was disorienting to anyone who saw it for the first time. The wingspan stretched to 172 feet wider than a B-29 Superfortress by a considerable margin. Yet there was no nose, no tail, no vertical stabilizer reaching skyward. Just a vast, curved, almost organic shape sitting on the tarmac at Northrop's facility, looking less like a weapon of war and more like something that had drifted in from the future. Power came from 8 Pratt & Whitney R4360 Wasp Major radial engines, the most powerful piston aircraft engines America produced during the war era, each displacing 4,360 cubic inches and capable of generating over 3,000 horsepower. But the installation was not conventional. The engines were buried within the winging pairs, driving counter-rotating pusher propellers through complex internal drive shafts and gearbox assemblies. This arrangement kept the leading edge aerodynamically clean. It also introduced what would become the program's most persistent and damaging problem. Those pusher propellers, twin counter-rotating units, mounted at the wing's trailing edge, were mechanically nightmarish. The gearboxes and drive shafts connecting the buried engines to the propeller hubs were long, complicated, and subjected to tremendous stress. Vibration was chronic. Components failed at rates that alarmed engineers from the earliest test runs. Northrop's team worked continuously to redesign and reinforce the propeller systems. But the fundamental challenge never fully went away. An aircraft this revolutionary was pushing against the absolute boundary of what American manufacturing could reliably produce in the 1940s. Construction of the first prototype proceeded through 1944 and into 1945. The war in Europe was still raging. The Pacific theater showed no sign of rapid resolution. The strategic rationale for an intercontinental bomber remained intact, and the Army Air Forces continued to fund the program even as the complexity and cost mounted. The first XB-35 was completed in the spring of 1946. The war had ended. Germany had surrendered in May 1945. Japan had surrendered in September. The strategic emergency that had created the requirement for the XB-35 had passed, but the Army Air Forces chose to continue. The aircraft represented too significant an investment to abandon without evaluation, and the emerging tensions of the post-war world were already hinting that intercontinental bomber capability would remain essential. On June 25, 1946, the XB-35 lifted off from Hawthorne Municipal Airport in California and flew to Morak Army Airfield, a vast, dry lake bed test facility in the Mojave Desert that would later become Edwards Air Force Base. The flight lasted approximately 45 minutes. The aircraft flew. It was airborne, it was controllable, and by any reasonable measure it was a remarkable achievement. No aircraft of this configuration, at this scale, had ever flown before. The chief test pilot for that initial flight was Mac Stanley, Northrop's senior experimental test pilot. Stanley was an experienced and technically sophisticated aviator, exactly the kind of man you needed in the left seat of something this unprecedented. His assessment after the first flight was cautious but professionally positive. The flying wing handled, basic aerodynamics worked, but there were problems already visible, and they were serious. The contra-rotating propeller systems were misbehaving. Vibration continued to be excessive. Engine cooling within the buried installation was uneven. The aircraft's directional control, managing yaw without a conventional vertical tail, relied on split flaps called elevons and drag rudders. A system that worked but demanded constant pilot attention at speeds and attitudes where a conventional aircraft would have been more forgiving. Flying the XB-35 was not a casual exercise. It required a crew that was continuously engaged, reading the aircraft, compensating for its idiosyncrasies. A second prototype joined the test program, and over the following months the two aircraft flew a combined total that was, by any honest accounting, disappointingly low. Mechanical groundings were frequent. The propeller drive system remained a chronic source of failures. On multiple occasions, test flights were aborted or cut short due to propeller or gearbox problems. The aircraft's potential was visible in its performance data range. Projections and aerodynamic efficiency measurements confirmed that. Northrop's underlying concept was sound, but the mechanical reliability needed to make a bomber operationally viable was simply not there. Then something happened that changed everything. Not a crash. Not a spectacular failure. Something quieter, and in some ways more consequential. The jet age arrived with a force no one had fully anticipated. By 1947 and into 1948, the Army Air Forces, now the independent United States Air Force, were looking at turbojet technology with a kind of urgent excitement. Jet engines promised speed. They promised altitude. They promised a different kind of warfare entirely. The piston engine era, which had defined everything from the P-51 to the B-29, was ending faster than almost anyone had predicted. Jack Northrop saw both the threat and the opportunity. His flying wing concept was not dependent on piston engines. The same aerodynamic advantages, the extreme range efficiency, the reduced drag applied equally, or more so with jet propulsion. He proposed converting the flying wing program to jets. The result was the YB-49, which took two of the XB-35 airframes, stripped out the piston engines and their nightmarish propeller systems, and installed 8 Allison J-35 turbojet engines in their place. The YB-49 flew for the first time in October 1947 and showed genuinely impressive performance. Maximum speed reached approximately 493 miles per hour. The range and altitude characteristics drew serious attention. For a brief period, it seemed as though the flying wing might survive the transition to the jet era. But the story took a devastating turn on June 5, 1948. The second YB-49 prototype, serial number 421-02368, broke apart in flight over the Mojave Desert during a high-speed test maneuver. All 5 crew members were killed. Among them was Captain Glenn Edwards, a highly regarded test pilot whose death would later be commemorated when Morak Army Airfield was renamed Edwards Air Force Base in his honor. The accident investigation pointed to structural failure during a maneuver that exceeded the aircraft's design limits, though the precise sequence of events was debated at the time and has been discussed by aviation historians since. What the crash undeniably did was cast a shadow over the entire program. It raised questions about the YB-49's structural integrity at the flight envelope boundaries that would be required for combat operations. The Air Force evaluation of the YB-49 as a potential strategic bomber continued. But another problem had emerged alongside the structural concerns. The aircraft's bombing accuracy was poor. The flying wing's inherent instability in the yaw axis, that same characteristic that made it demanding to fly, also made it difficult to hold the precise, steady flight path required for accurate high-altitude bombing. The technology of the era offered no easy solution. Autopilot systems capable of compensating for the wing's yaw characteristics were not yet mature enough to solve the problem reliably. There was also, it must be said, the matter of institutional politics. The Air Force was in the process of selecting a next-generation strategic bomber, and the competition was fierce. Convair was developing the B-36 Peacemaker, a conventional, enormous, piston-and-jet hybrid that lacked the XB-35's aerodynamic elegance, but offered proven reliability and better bombing stability. The B-36 had powerful advocates within the Air Force hierarchy and within the political world of defense procurement. In January 1949, the Air Force canceled the YB-49 program. The remaining flying wing airframes, including those still configured as XB-35s, were ordered scrapped. The decision was made with a speed and finality that shocked Northrop and his team. Years of work. Hundreds of millions of dollars. An aircraft that had genuinely flown, that had demonstrated real potential, reduced to scrap metal on the Mojave Desert floor. Jack Northrop never fully accepted the cancellation as a purely technical decision. In a remarkable interview he gave near the end of his life in 1979, he suggested that the decision had been influenced by factors beyond engineering merit, specifically referencing a proposed merger between Northrop and Convair that Northrop had refused to approve, and implying that the cancellation may have been connected to that refusal. He was elderly, and his account is unverified by documentary evidence. But the allegation has never been fully dismissed either, and it has remained part of the XB-35 story for decades. What is not disputed is the legacy. Jack Northrop had proved that a large flying wing could fly. He had proved the aerodynamic concept was sound. The instability problems and the mechanical failures were real, but there were problems that later technology would eventually solve. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, which entered service with the United States Air Force in 1997, is a flying wing. It flies with the help of advanced fly-by-wire computer systems that continuously compensate for exactly the kind of yaw instability that defeated the XB-35 and YB-49 programs. Every time a B-2 takes off, it is doing something that the engineers at Northrop's Hawthorne facility understood was possible in 1944, but could not yet build the technology to achieve. When Jack Northrop was shown a model of the B-2 in 1980, just months before his death, confined to a wheelchair, barely able to speak following a stroke, those who were present reported that he wept. He had been right. He had simply been right, too early. The XB-35 and its successors were not failures of imagination. They were not failures of engineering courage. They were a collision between a vision that was genuinely ahead of its time and the hard ceiling of what mid-20th century technology could reliably sustain. In another decade, with fly-by-wire systems and better manufacturing tolerances, the story might have ended differently. Instead, the prototypes were cut up on the desert floor, the classified files were buried in government archives, and America flew on with conventional bombers while Jack Northrop's flying wing waited for 50 more years to finally take the sky.